Okay, hello everyone. My name is Aaron Olajide. I'm a project lead at the Innovation Law Club Africa. And today we are opportunity to have Ashlin, who is a partner at Baker and McKenzie, to take us on the topic regulating cryptocurrency in Africa. Ashlin is very, very reputable. I'll allow him to quickly do an introduction of himself before he starts presenting. But we are very excited about this topic. We think that cryptocurrency is changing significantly the operations in the financial services industry, and this will likely to continue over the next few decades until perhaps a new instrument comes into play. So this particular masterclass is part of a series of masterclasses we put together for our current fellows at the ILCA. We have, however, decided to extend it to current members of the ILCA as well. So wishing everyone a really great time. And yeah, over to you, Ashley.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for hosting me at today's masterclass. So the topic for today is regulating cryptocurrency in Africa. Now, just as a little bit of background, as mentioned, I'm a partner at Baker McKenzie. I'm part of both the corporate and mergers and acquisitions department, as well as our IP tech department. And I specialize in finding commercial solutions for technological products and services rendered by clients. And as part of that journey, I've been assisting and advising in South Africa and partially on the African continent in terms of blockchain technologies, specifically cryptocurrencies, since 2017. I was also fortunate enough to spend about 6 months in San Francisco at the World Economic Forum, conducting research in respect of stable coins, which are a close cousin of cryptocurrencies. Basically, they're stabilized cryptocurrencies. So over this time, I've been very lucky enough to get a bit of insight into the industry and worked with many interesting clients in the space. And I hope to share with you some of those thoughts and observations during this presentation. So the agenda for the discussion today is going to follow the following order. Firstly, I'll go through a quick introduction, just in respect of some themes that are influencing the cryptocurrency industry. Then I'll go into a description and explanation of how cryptocurrencies work, what are the mechanisms that underlie them, hopefully not skimming over too much of the technical detail and simplifying it as far as possible. Ending off with some insight in respect to the regulatory landscape in Africa and the approaches to regulation in Africa. Now, as an introduction, we're currently standing on the brink of a technological revolution as we're moving into the fourth industrial revolution, or revolution 4.0. And in the scale, scope, and complexity of transformation that's happening across various aspects of economies, one such impact is coming from the payments and financial sector. I think we're standing on the brink of the biggest financial overhaul we've seen in recent history, and part of that's been bolstered by new technologies challenging the current financial systems, such as cryptocurrencies. Now, I think cryptocurrencies were fairly new about 5 years ago, but right now, cryptocurrencies and blockchain are mainstream. Cryptocurrencies are becoming a matter of interest for banks, governments around the world. And just like Bitcoin was once a topic discussed mostly by techies and tech enthusiasts, they're now making headlines on a regular basis, including on many government posts and government announcements. Due to the growth of discussion of the economic impact of cryptocurrencies and government institutions, is now having the potential to disrupt even the current monetary models. Through discussions on the introduction of regulations by economic institutions and through the increase of interest by investors, as well as platforms run by decentralized organizations, the adoption of some level of these technologies into the 4IR movement is basically inevitable. So safe to say that blockchain is mainstream and cryptocurrency is mainstream. And therefore, as lawyers, we will need to understand and be able to navigate the legal requirements in respect of blockchain and cryptocurrency technologies into the future. Now, in the African ecosystem, financial technologies are not new, and they're also quite robust on the continent. Because of various reasons, such as the need for technology, a lack of legacy infrastructure, the African fintech ecosystem has leapfrogged many much more developed countries or first world countries in respect of financial technologies. As you can see on the screen, there are several financial technology industries that are well developed in Africa, such as the payments ecosystem with the likes of solutions based out of Kenya and Nigeria, the lending ecosystem, savings and deposits, insurance technologies, investments, financial planning and advisory, capital raising, and business-to-business tech. As part of the investment arm, we find cryptocurrencies. So now let's go into a little bit of a description of what cryptocurrencies are and how do they work. To do so, we first need to understand where did this movement come from and why is there such a thing as cryptocurrencies? Now, this largely emerged from what is called the cypherpunk movement from the 1980s and 1990s. Cypherpunks basically believed that the great question of politics in the age of the internet was whether the state would erode individual freedoms and privacy through its newfound unfettered powers of electronic surveillance. So Bitcoin, the original cryptocurrencies, was introduced in 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto, a pseudonym for an individual we still don't know the identity of, and is by far the most well-known and popular cryptocurrency in the world. Blockchain is basically the technology rails that it runs on. And following the economic crisis in 2008, the distrust in respect of the financial system was met with the cypherpunk movement towards creating alternate methods of finance and transfers of value. These movements naturally found their way into the African continent because those same requirements were much needed by the unbanked and underbanked population we see on the continent. So it was a natural fit. But it's good to remember that Bitcoin was created to disrupt. By its very nature, it came out of a movement that was aimed at disrupting electronic cash and allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through the traditional centralized means. So moving on from that movement and sort of the direction that cryptocurrencies came from, I think it's safe to say that it's a good question to ask, what is a cryptocurrency? Now, many discussions on cryptocurrencies can get quite technological and quite confusing, and I'll try and simplify this insofar as possible. I think if you think of cryptocurrency, the best way to think about it is as part of a wider onion of technologies. The ultimate technology that has created cryptocurrencies actually emerged before the movement of cryptocurrencies and is known as distributed ledger technology. I'll give you a little bit of a description of what distributed ledger technology is. On top of distributed ledger technology, we have blockchain technology, which is basically a species of distributed ledger technology. On top of that, we've got public and private permissioned and permissionless blockchains. These are iterations of the blockchain technology. And as one use case of that, we have cryptocurrencies. So I know that's quite a mouthful and it might seem quite complicated, but we'll go through these one by one. Now, what is distributed ledger technology? The best way I can describe it is to go back to actual ledgers. Now, it's funny to say that even though blockchain technology is one of the most novel new technologies, one could argue that the ledger is actually one of the oldest written technologies. If you go to the first recorded forms of writing, that's cuneiform, the first recorded statements in cuneiform were ledger entries. So ledgers are basically as old as writing itself. Now, ledgers were typically used to record the transfer of value from individual to individual. Previously in marketplaces in Antwerp, in Amsterdam, and other places, there were merchants who would travel and would want to record the transfer value from one to the other. As the financial systems developed and increasingly banks were required to facilitate transfers because people didn't want to walk around with bags of cash anymore, banks became the decision makers and holders of these ledgers. Essentially, banks would take the deposits of cash and would then record the transfers of value from individual to individual by creating accounts in their systems and recording ledger entries against those individuals. As we moved into the millennium, these became more and more digitalized, and to the extent where digital ledgers have completely replaced traditional ledgers. Now, these were still maintained in electronic systems procured and maintained by banks. So these digital ledgers were held by banks, and this is what's called a centralized ledger technology. Now, these centralized ledger technologies were procured by the banks, and over time began representing money itself. Once the US went off of the gold standard system and the rest of the world followed, the ledger entries in both the central bank, that's the main bank of last resort of a country, and the commercial banks, that's the banks you and I would use in the retail sector, the money represented in their ledgers became actual money, i.e. without the backing of any gold statement and rather backed purely by the sovereign liquidity of the country. Now, this is what's called centralized technologies and a centralized ledger technology. The alternatives which emerged to centralized ledger technologies were decentralized ledger technologies and distributed ledger technologies. The best way I can describe these types of technologies is to think about each of the blobs as a train station and each of the lines as a rail between train stations. So in the centralized model, all movements had to go through a central node. In the decentralized model, there is no central node, but there are pools of connection which connect the wider array of ultimate nodes. In distributed technologies, each node is a peer to the other. There is no central node, and finding the path between one node and another has no specific hierarchy to it. That is distributed technologies. Now, blockchain is basically one type of that. It is a distributed ledger technology. And I just wanted to quickly show you what a ledger entry in this system would look like. Now, with blockchain technologies, each individual in the system has a copy of the ledger. So if you've got 40 people in that distributed network, 40 train stations, so to speak, each one of the train stations has a copy of the ledger, the specific ledger. And if I want to say that I have made a transaction in that ledger, I would broadcast to the system, essentially making a change to my copy of the ledger and broadcasting it to the wider network, basically telling everyone, hey, everyone, here's the change I've made in my ledger. Would you please update yours? The example I've got on screen here is in block 1000. There's a transaction that's been made for 17 Bitcoin. Now, suppose I edit that block on my computer to fraudulently give myself Bitcoin that I shouldn't have. Because of the way in which blockchain works and the way in which blockchain structures work, the broadcasted array of transactions have all been cryptographically sealed. So if I change any node in that chain of entries, any person in the node would be able to check that because one change would have ultimately affected the entire cryptographic hash of that particular transaction. Now, I'll show what that means in a second, but safe to say that what that does is it prevents a person from editing any particular node and creating a false entry. Now, the core thing to remember here, without getting too bogged down in the technology, is that that specific ability allows one to trust the ledger architecture and the ledger system rather than trusting an individual party. That is the secret sauce behind blockchain technology, i.e. the lack of a need for a central person or a central decision maker or arbiter to validate transactions. Now, don't get too bogged down in the technology. It's hard to get your head around, even for technologists and especially for lawyers. It's better to drill down on exactly what is, rather than drilling down on what is a blockchain. It's best to think about the world's most known blockchain, and that's the Bitcoin blockchain. It's the best example we have. It's the one that I think is easiest to explain because we should all have at least heard about it in the news by now. But I would want to add this one caveat that not all ledgers will be similar. There's a whole variety of different alternatives to the type of blockchain ledger that's used by Bitcoin. Now, focusing on the decentralized ledger. Sorry, is someone on whiteboard mode by any chance? Okay, let me continue. Focusing on the decentralized aspects of the Bitcoin network, what it does is it allows peer-to-peer transactions to happen without an intermediary. Transactions are verified across a network of computers, as I mentioned, each one being a node. Each transaction is transmitted to all nodes and must be verified before you can trust that specific chain. It involves mining, and mining is basically allowing your computer to solve a particular mathematical problem if it's a proof of work system. And that mining and solving of a problem will then result in rewards in the form of ledger entries to your specific account. And that's essentially how you would create tokens in the Bitcoin network. Once verified, new blocks can be added to the ledger. Each block contains a timestamp and a unique fingerprint or hash of every previous block. And what that does is what I mentioned earlier. It allows you to always verify blocks that have been captured in the network. Everyone in the network can see the entire chain. The specific use of encryption and distributed nature makes the ledger very secure. And once recorded, this is very difficult to change. And that's the primary aspect that we need to remember when we're looking at these type of networks. Now, to make it very simple and to summarize the process, say party A wanted to transfer value to party B, there would be cryptographic keys assigned to both of them. The transaction would be represented online as a block, and they would lock those using their own cryptographic keys. That block is then broadcast to every network in every party in the network. Participants in the network then do some work. They do some work to validate it, and their validation is rewarded by the increase of their accounts in an amount of specified cryptocurrency. And the block is then date stamped and then cryptographically signed, and then a new block is added to the chain, very much as you would add a Lego block to a pile of Lego. And then the transaction is confirmed, and we would move on to the next block. Now, how does this differ from the traditional approach? Previously, if you wanted to transfer money to another person, so say Amy wanted to transfer money to Bob, Amy would instruct her bank. Her bank would have a settlement process where they would settle all of the transactions that have occurred across their customers with Bob's bank, and then Bob's bank would update the ledger entry for Bob. In the blockchain approach, Amy would then utilize the system. She would broadcast the entry after it's been cryptographically signed between her and Bob, and that would be the transaction. There's no need for any intermediary in between. Now, there are three major models which have emerged in respect of these types of change. The first one is the centralized system, which we've already discussed. The second is a public permissionless blockchain. And these are open networks that anybody can access. The digital ledger of transactions is shared, is transparent, and run by all applicants. Bitcoin is a good example of a public permissionless blockchain. Now, there are benefits to public permissionless blockchains. And the first one is that they are not centrally controlled by anyone. So they basically achieve what the original cypherpunk movement wanted to achieve, which is to have independence from the current financial system. The downside to public blockchains is there is still indeed a degree of risk in respect of anonymity. They are great rails for money laundering and fraud, and this is partly what has created a fairly negative connotation with some of these technologies. And lastly, they are very, very high in energy consumption and energy usage, which is becoming more and more important as we see ESG movements appear around the world. Private blockchains or permission blockchains, this is the preferred option for most regulated entities. It's a private system, basically an internal network, not connected to open systems, and typically requires invitation to enter the system, and would not be an open network. So the energy usage is usually much lower because you don't need a variety of trust providers. And quite importantly, these systems are far more secure and have nodes of control. Now, from a legal perspective, the important difference between Model 2 and Model 3 is that with Model 2, who do you regulate? who is the individual touch point that you apply your laws to and have them binding. That is difficult in public blockchains. And this is why you'll see regulators try to quash and not be supportive of public blockchains. Private blockchains are typically much better because you usually have nodes or individual organizations at certain points which can be regulated. Now, just quickly, use of blockchain goes outside cryptocurrencies. There's many other industries which are affected by it. I'm not going to go into detail on them now, but safe to say blockchain technology is independent from cryptocurrencies. There are other use cases such as property transfers, creative services, non-fungible tokens, which you might have heard about in the news to represent art. There are many other use cases for blockchain. Now, when it comes to the legal issues that surround blockchain and cryptocurrencies, the one thing to remember, and this has definitely been the case for Africa, is it's unclear what the regulatory environment is and what legal risks are to be identified. Law is always playing catch up, and even till now is still doing so. There is limited legal and regulatory developments globally, even though in some jurisdictions they're starting to emerge a degree of regulation. By and large, specified regulations alone. Regulators are generally taking a wait and see approach. I would say that statement was true maybe a year or two ago. That's becoming less true with recent developments happening in South Africa and other places such as Europe, and to some degree, some other countries in Africa, where the regulators are now starting to move ahead and make formal pronouncements. For now, applying existing law to each case seems to be the approach, and it's worthwhile monitoring legal developments. Now, just quickly, cryptocurrency before we dive into the key legal aspects. Cryptocurrencies, as I mentioned, are a species of blockchain. They're a use case of blockchain. If you say a cryptocurrency, if you're talking about a specific cryptocurrency, what you're actually talking about is a unit entered into a ledger in a cryptocurrency system that has been created for example, payments and settlements. There's a whole zoo of competing cryptocurrencies that have emerged. And funny enough, and quite interestingly, Bitcoin has now recently passed the South African Rand 1 million mark in terms of value. Although there are a lot of debates and arguments as to how this value can be looked at from a fundamentals perspective. Now, I'm not going to go into the comparison there between that and how fiat currencies are actually quite similar. Safe to say that cryptocurrencies have reached mainstream volume in terms of the amount of value that is now being transacted through them. In terms of commonality across jurisdictions, Nigeria is exceptionally high in respect of cryptocurrency usage or ownership and value storage, even higher than the likes of Switzerland, parts of China and the US in terms of the respondents from those countries. So Africa does play quite significantly in terms of the volume of Bitcoin transactions and cryptocurrency transactions. Now, what is the difference between cryptocurrency and fiat? As I mentioned, and using Bitcoin as the example, cryptocurrency is created by decentralized distributed computing. It's governed typically, not always, by majority rule. Transactions involve two parties and no intermediaries required, and it depends on network speed. It can be very, very quick in terms of transaction speed, and there's no chargeback or rectification possible because of the way in which transactions are recorded. Fiat or traditional money is very different. Fiat is typically issued by government through their central bank. It's governed by the central bank. So because it's issued by the central bank is able to control it in respect of inflation and other economic requirements. An intermediary is typically present, such as a bank, and normally a bank, and those intermediaries are usually connected with the central bank. So they're typically engaging in and distributing the sovereign's monetary policy through their intermediary role in the monetary system. Transactions can take very long. So one of the major downfalls of the fiat system is that because of the way in which it works and because the number of centralized nodes, transactions are slow. And chargeback is possible because of these being internally held and correctable ledger entries in banks' systems. Now, let's jump into the regulatory landscape. Now, there are two ways to look at the regulatory landscape for cryptocurrencies. The first is to look at laws of special application. And this is the great question. Do cryptocurrencies amount to something different in terms of what they provide society and what risks they create for society as a whole, as well as consumers? Do they need specialized laws? The other approach is laws of general application, or lex generalis, to quote the Latin term. This is following the approach of, if it's the same activity and it provides the same risk, then it should follow the same regulation. Now, globally, as well as in Africa, the approach is to adopt the latter first, i.e. to say, let's classify these activities in terms of what we know. Let's use that as a means to then regulate them and apply laws that already exist and already have long legs of jurisprudence to cryptocurrencies. And then let's see, well, where are the delta gaps? Where do we need to create new laws? And I will say there are very few countries, if any, in Africa who have created new laws. By and large, it's laws of general application that are most important when it comes to cryptocurrencies, although this may change over time. So when it comes to that, I think the first thing for laws of general application is classification, i.e. classifying the relevant cryptocurrency in terms of a pillar that already has regulations applying to it. Now, there are 8 different types of classifications I just want to quickly raise. The first is classification as a currency token. This is where a token is regarded as a medium of exchange, potentially a storm of value, and a form of payment, i.e. in the same way in which you would use your credit card and your bank would make entries based on that card within their system using the credit card's acquirer system. These tokens formulate a solution or form a token in that typical solution chain. And the normal laws that would then apply to currency tokens would be your payment system laws, so those that are issued by a central bank in terms of payment systems. Cryptocurrencies can also be, or tokens in crypto systems could also be regarded as utility tokens. These are multifunctional tokens that give holders access to products or services. They function more like vouchers, vouchers which entitle you to a service. There's also security tokens. Now, security tokens became very important in 2017 with the ICO boom. This was when many companies, in seeking crowdfunding, would issue a cryptocurrency token regarded as a security token, almost in the same way as you would issue equity in a company in return for funds, with investors looking at those tokens and investing in them on the basis that they could have those accrue in value in the same way that Bitcoin accrued in value and other tokens accrued in value. Security tokens typically get regulated within the realm of the security laws of a country and the relevant requirements for announcements and making of offers to the public. Asset tokens are becoming more prevalent, with non-fungible tokens becoming relevant in the news. Asset tokens basically represent, they're like representations, almost like title deeds representing an asset. It could be a real world asset. So for example, in property blockchain systems, these could represent actual houses or land, but they could also represent digital assets, such as what's becoming more prevalent with the non-fungible token environment and the representation of digital art. Now, there are a couple of others that are slightly more complicated. There are transactional tokens. These are those that are used to transact and serve as units of account and exchange for goods and services. There are governance tokens. Governance tokens function very similar to units of a right to vote. So like shareholders would have voting rights, governance tokens function as a voting right within a governance system or protocol in a cryptocurrency system. The next is rewards tokens. These are tokens that could be issued as rewards as part of a royalty program. And lastly, equity tokens, which could represent actual equity or ownership in a real company or decentralized organization. Now, that's quite a mouthful in terms of the approach and the types of classifications. What is emerging, and this is both coming out of Europe and is slowly being adopted by regulators in Africa, and that is the move away from the term cryptocurrency. As you would have seen from what I've described, not everything fits into the realm of what would be a currency. Many of these examples fit more into the realm of what constitute assets, and that's how they've been used typically in the market. If you look at the volume of usage of cryptocurrencies as currencies versus cryptocurrencies as a storage of value or an investment potential, more often than not, these are used as crypto assets. So both the Financial Action Task Force, it's the FATF, as well as governments such as South Africa and I think Kenya, they're referring to crypto assets, no longer cryptocurrencies. So, and another reason for that is obviously there is a hesitance by central banks to give them the status of currency and to use that terminology. So when referring to cryptocurrencies, and specifically when reviewing them in laws and identifying laws that apply, it might be useful to start using the term crypto assets as a term rather than cryptocurrencies. Now, regulatory systems, when it comes to the key aspects of a regulatory system, when it comes to cryptocurrencies, these 6 items are the most important regulatory channels or avenues you will see applied to cryptocurrencies. The first is obviously central banks and central bank currency management. Now, as I mentioned, your central bank in most countries is established as the facilitator for the monetary policy of a country. In other words, their duty is not only to issue currency, but also to regulate the use of that currency in a market to ensure financial stability, as well as the control by the sovereign nation of its currency system. And that's why one of the first regulatory aspects you will encounter in respect of all jurisdiction is a declaration from the central bank as to whether cryptocurrencies are currencies and whether they are legal tender. Just about every country in Africa has declared that they are not regarded as legal tender. There is only one country in Latin America which has regarded Bitcoin as currency, and arguably this has not been an efficient solution. So there's only one country in the world that really regards cryptocurrencies as actual currency. The next is financial stability. Now, financial stability is typically maintained by a country's financial sector laws. The financial sector laws would regulate things such as public trading. They would regulate things such as the behavior of banks. And the issue that cryptocurrencies place is that whereas the current issuer of currency, the central bank, and the sub-layer with the commercial banks are regulated and have to maintain, for example, value-based requirements such as currency reserves and deposit guarantees, that doesn't exist in the cryptocurrency world. There is no guarantee of value. There's no guarantee of redemption of your money that is converted from fiat to cryptocurrencies. So financial stability is another key layer of regulation for every country. Next is deposit taking. Now, deposit taking is bank regulation. Deposit takers are typically banks. These are those who would take value in the form of fiat money. It used to be gold, but now it's just the taking of your salary payslip into a bank account. Those deposit takers and money lenders are regulated in terms of financial stability. And therefore, one aspect to always look out for is the definitions of what would constitute a bank in your relevant country. And even though this might not apply to cryptocurrencies, cryptocurrencies typically use wallets, digital wallets. These are basically storage points where a person would store their key and password in respect of their cryptocurrencies that are kept on a ledger. And by doing so, the individual has loaded that amount to an extent in the ordinary conventional way of describing it to their wallet. Certain wallet providers, based on the definitions of banks in some countries, might actually qualify as banks because of the wide definitions. South Africa is a good example of that. There are many e-wallet providers who may actually constitute banks. The next is investment and consumer protection. So when it comes to consumer protection and investment, there is a recognition that many cryptocurrency systems and specific wallet providers, they provide mechanisms that mimic or look very similar to traditional banking means and traditional banking systems. And the risk with that is obviously that these systems don't have the same regulatory protections behind them for consumers as would your traditional mechanisms. Now, this has become very, very prominent in South Africa, where there have been a number of scams. And those scams have targeted typically not the cryptocurrency ledgers themselves, but the custodians thereof. So those are individuals who provide services, for example, online ledgers, online exchanges, non-localized wallet providers, and the like, who have a custodial holdership of these cryptocurrencies. And the risk there is that we don't really have great laws regarding the custodial holdership of cryptocurrencies. And as such, from a consumer protection perspective, many countries such as South Africa and Nigeria have made pronouncements that that individuals or consumers rather ought to be very careful when depositing or using these types of systems, because there's a high risk of fraud and theft because of the second tier custodial holderships. Tax is becoming quite important. In South Africa, your tax filings now require you to declare whether you've had any cryptocurrency gains in the past number of years. And tax is becoming increasingly a point of contention when it comes to the cryptocurrency systems, because it's very difficult for regulators to see the transactions in a way that allow them to tax them. What we've seen is regulators actually engaging with some of the exchanges and requesting lists of South Africans or people in a particular country who have transacted on the cryptocurrency exchanges, and then using those for audit assessments. So regulators are getting quite clued up in terms of how to find out whether there have been tax gains or losses in respect of cryptocurrencies. And last but not least is anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. When it comes to these aspects, there's been a lot of room that's been covered due to the work of the Financial Action Task Force, which is basically a global body regulating anti-money laundering laws, and many of their laws have been promoted across the globe and including in some African countries. And the approach right now is to decide whether or not accountable institutions within an anti-money laundering scheme or system ought to be conducting know your client assessments in respect of nodes of connection to people investing in cryptocurrencies. Now, just quickly, I wanted to give a picture of the South African regulators. There are a number of South African regulators who would be relevant. They include the National Treasury, Prudential Authority, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, which implements our financial stability. Now, those first three regulators would look after the monetary policy that's issued by the central bank, as well as financial stability. The next regulators are more consumer or retail facing, such as the Financial Intelligence Center, South Africa's anti-money laundering system, and the National Credit Regulator when it comes to lending systems in cryptocurrencies. And then last but not least, the JSE and PASA. What the South African regulators have done, which is quite interesting, is aggregated into a uniform body called the Intergovernmental Fintech Working Group. And this group has been very active in both conducting research as well as releasing research papers in respect of their approach towards cryptocurrency. Now, the discussion on what they've been identifying as requirements is a topic for a whole other discussion. Safe to say that they have been a very active body and a coordinated body within the South African ecosystem. Nigeria has similar regulators across a number of their pillars, which we discussed earlier, and each one of these would be looking at it in a similar way, i.e. the SEC of securities is very active in respect of cryptocurrency regulations in Nigeria. But I think it would be better to go on to a more detailed analysis of what are the key aspects that influence country laws in Africa. Now, the first is to remember that governments derive their power largely from control of the financial sector. That is incredibly important because control of the financial sector, control of the tax base is a key aspect of a sovereign country. This is why it is so important for African regulators to have control over the financial sector, as well as control over the consumers within a financial sector. It is important to understand that when making regulations, countries are thinking about this. They're thinking about their ability to control a particular system. In addition to that, there is also the concept of regulatory arbitrage. Now, this refers to the benefit of making your regulations very friendly as opposed to very oppressive to attract foreign direct investment. And a good country example of that is Mauritius, who has taken a very different approach to some of the other African countries. It's also So when it comes to regulatory considerations, it's important to remember that cryptocurrencies are becoming a store of value, and this threatens both the monetary sovereignty, but also the capital base in many African countries. And that's why you will see other countries who are not taking a friendly approach being very hesitant towards how they approach cryptocurrencies. And lastly, there are those who are trying to create friendly but not too friendly regulations, those who are kind of sitting in the middle. And I'd say South Africa is a good example of one of those jurisdictions. Now, just quickly noting that we are almost at the time for questions. I'm just going to quickly go through one of two countries in respect of their specific regulations. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are laws of general application, there's laws of specific application. So when I say a company does not have any laws of regulations, it doesn't mean that there are no laws that apply to cryptocurrencies. Rather, there are no laws of special application or targeted application which have been created in that country for cryptocurrencies. As mentioned, there are many laws which could apply based on their categorization within other pillars of regulation. Now, with that in mind, South Africa does not have any specified crypto-related laws or regulations. However, as mentioned, the IFWG, a body coordinating South African financial regulators on fintech policy and regulation, has published a very, very interesting position paper in June this year, which unequivocally states that crypto assets cannot remain unregulated. So we're on the path in South Africa towards regulation. In fact, there have been 25 recommendations within this report, which are quite far-reaching in terms of the application. One example of that would be a requirement that no derivative trading can occur, which is based or linked to crypto assets. And the obvious downfall to that is that you couldn't establish equity traded funds or exchange traded funds rather, or ETFs on the basis of cryptocurrencies. So South African regulations are taking a much more of a hardline approach. Obviously, these are recommendations. None of this is law yet, but what we have seen is South African banks who act as authorized dealers starting to enforce some of these regulations as if they're laws. So there is quite a big debate in respect of the future. Further, there is a recognition of crypto assets as capital for exchange control purposes, and as well as the regulation of crypto asset trading platforms, which are called CATPs, and crypto asset service providers. So that could be exchanges and wallet providers. In Kenya, there's no regulations that regulate the use of crypto assets either. However, the Central Bank of Kenya has warned the Kenyan public against dealing in virtual currencies, and the Capital Markets Authority has cautioned that it has not approved any initial coin offerings because of the perceived volatility. The notice by the central bank stated that crypto virtual assets are not acceptable since they're not legal tender. However, it's still unclear what the legal position is in respect of virtual currencies that have been designated as legal tender in foreign jurisdictions, as they would fall within the definitions in Kenyan law, which relate to foreign currency. In respect of Nigeria, there are no regulations that specific regulations deal with crypto assets in Nigeria. Nigeria has taken a very hard approach. They've released a letter addressed to their banks and other financial institutions that states that dealing in cryptocurrencies and facilitating payments for cryptocurrencies are prohibited. The Central Bank of Nigeria also instructed all banks and other financial institutions to identify the individuals or entities who transacted in cryptocurrencies or operate these exchanges and close their accounts. The Securities and Exchange Commission has also issued a statement on digital assets, with the primary concern of crypto regulation in Nigeria. They've stated that they would regulate innovation in the cryptocurrency sector in three ways: ensuring safety, creating a deeper market, and providing solutions to issues that would lead its regulations. Moving on to Mauritius, I'll just spend a few seconds on Mauritius because it's an interesting one because they've had very friendly crypto asset laws. Mauritius was, I think, the first country in Africa to have regulatory sandboxes back in 2017. However, on 17 June 2020, the Mauritian Financial Services Commission announced a new framework for security tokens, including the requirements to comply with anti-money laws and combating financing of terrorism laws, as well as data protection laws and good market practice. Ghana also has no specific laws, but from a regulatory standpoint, they have ruled that the use of cryptocurrencies to buy goods or services is illegal. It is therefore also illegal to establish exchanges for this in Namibia. The Bank of Namibia is on course to complete its study into cryptocurrencies by April next year. The government has said that cryptocurrencies are not legal tender, as there's no provision for digital currency use in their laws. Last but not least, Botswana. There are no regulations that regulate the use of cryptocurrencies in Botswana, but the Bank of Botswana has not released any regulation on cryptocurrency or blockchain technology, and has reported stated that it has no intention for regulating cryptocurrency specifically at all. So that was quite a tour de force. I know there was quite a lot of information to digest, and many of these areas can go into much deeper discussion, but I hope that gave a little bit of a flavor of both what the industry was about, the direction it was heading, as well as the key themes that have emerged and some aspects in terms of African regulation. I'll now happily take any questions that you may have based on the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ashlin. I mean, this is the most detailed class I've attended on cryptocurrency ever. So thank you so much for putting a lot of effort into this. So I have some really interesting questions here. And so if I may start, so this person is saying, what is the, okay, yeah. So are there any trends within tax regulatory framework that are incorporating cryptocurrency transactions or earnings from cryptocurrency transactions? Is there any indication that there might be some tax regulations in this regard? And if at all, how should countries approach this going forward?
So absolutely. I think the major problem with cryptocurrencies and what a lot of tax authorities firstly having to counter with is access to information. Now, there are countries which will allow a tax authority to demand that a cryptocurrency exchange disclose its customers in such a way that the tax authority could conduct audits, but that's not always the case. So as a first port of call, there's the access to information question, which has emerged. And that's been sort of quite a prominent discussion. The second is the classifications. Obviously, if crypto is earned as income and is represented as income, it would be taxed very differently to cryptocurrency that has been held as a pure asset. Now, this is where there's a huge amount of disagreement, I think, between the industry and the tax authorities, because whereas the tax authorities would prefer to see a lot of the income generated from cryptocurrency as taxed, the problem is that you only really realize the benefit of those incomes when you convert them back to fiat currency. If you never convert your cryptocurrency back to fiat currency, how does a tax authority tax you? How do they even know that you have an amount to be taxed? So some authorities are starting to create quasi-taxes, which essentially look at declaring that you have made a gain and therefore owe tax, even though you've not converted it back to ordinary fiat currency. But there's a lot of debate, and the market's obviously not very happy with that approach. So I think, I mean, there's a couple of other themes, but I think those are important ones to bear in mind in respect of the direction that regulators are going from a tax perspective.
I mean, that's great, really, because, I mean, as you mentioned, the fact that most of these transactions are practically anonymous, and so it's very difficult to, and I mean, tax regimes and regulations depend mainly on being able to identify a particular person, tying that particular person to that specific transactions and earnings. So it would be interesting to see people volunteering to disclose their earnings from crypto transactions. So this next question is more from a data protection perspective, and the person is saying, how can cryptocurrency operators comply with data protection laws? Of course, since the publication of the GDPR, we've seen significant increase, at least within the African markets, of countries adopting various data protection regulations, right? And so we're also seeing significant increase in them insisting on compliance with these regulations, right? We're also seeing investors insisting on their investee companies to have specific data protection clauses in their contracts, whether with vendors or just their service level contracts. So coming back to cryptocurrency, how do you think compliance can play out in this space? How is it currently playing out? How can we do it better? And is there even any opportunity in this space for improvement at all?
Absolutely. It's a very interesting question, and perhaps one that goes back to the genesis of cryptocurrencies. Now, I'm going to step outside of cryptocurrencies for a second because this is relevant, but there's another movement that's starting to develop, and that's central bank digital currencies and stable coins. And now these are I'll call them the cousins of cryptocurrencies that are emerging, with central bank digital currencies being the government issued version of cryptocurrencies. And the major risk that has been pointed out with the government issued versions is, well, this could allow for surveillance, because now you would have a government having not just information about the fund flows of individuals, but also their transactions. So that's transactional information. And transactional information in the hands of one government could be used very differently from another. I think it's always good to remember that our privacy laws and the right to privacy first emerged, even in Europe, as a protection from surveillance by the state. So when it comes to the genesis of privacy laws, we do have to remember that there's the non-commercial aspect, which is prevention of surveillance. Then there's the second aspect, which is the commercial transfer and cross-border flows of private information. And to enable that, the privacy laws such as the directive and now the GDPR in Europe was created, and that's gone on to influence the rest of the world. Now, it's important to bear in mind that those regulations were created to actually facilitate the transfer of information, but do so within a standard that was acceptable by the constituent community. Now, I say those two aspects because on the one hand, cryptocurrencies actually aid in privacy. When I looked at or mentioned public permissionless cryptocurrencies, one aspect that was very useful is the ability to transact without the disclosure of information of an individual. However, arguably, the location or the public key that is used for the address of that individual on the public ledger could in some laws be regarded as an anonymization and not, a pseudonymization, not an anonymization. So arguably in some systems, you are still required to apply privacy laws. On the other hand, where you have permissioned chains, there you might have individual nodes who are able to control information, and depending on what the nature of the blockchain structure is, they could be determining what the requirements are or determining what the use of information will be, which would typically render them to be information controllers or responsible parties within a specific data protection regime. So it's quite a complicated question because whereas cryptocurrencies blockchain can aid privacy as a form of privacy by design, they could also reduce privacy if configured in a way that does so. So I almost want to say that the aim should be to look at these kind of structures, conduct privacy and security audits to better understand where do you fall on the spectrum. Is it a system that benefits privacy, or is it a system that reduces privacy, and then go from there?
Thank you so much, Ashlin. And I mean, this next question is more on again, still on the regulatory side, but more on the regulator side. So what we're seeing since the more pronounced traction for cryptocurrency is a trend where central banks are saying, hey, we also have our digital currencies, and so we're really going to promote that. Recently, Nigeria launched what they referred to as Naira, right? Which, I mean, got some kind of excitement on some parts, but on the flip side, it's, you know, some of the very interesting implementation mechanism that was used for it, right? So do you think that central bank digital currencies would at any point in time sort of displace the place of cryptocurrency, particularly because of this element of anonymity that is practically removed from central bank digital currencies?
Absolutely. So I would almost say, so in-era is a form of central bank digital currency, or CBDC. And I would say that although it's dovetailed with the emergence of cryptocurrencies, and perhaps was even bolstered by it, so governments realized that they needed to move ahead with digitization of money, I will say that in my mind, when you look at the current iterations of CBDCs, they're more a development of the legacy systems of monetary policy. If you look at how banks currently work with what are called real-time gross settlement systems within central banks, which allow for commercial banks to settle their transactions into the central banks, those are very old, they're very slow, and they result in a lot of lost information when it comes to the benefits that you can get from the programmability of money, for example. So I think noticing that and maybe adopting a few leaves out of the book of cryptocurrencies, banks are central banks are developing new alternatives to their own monetary systems and their own fiat currencies. And I wouldn't say that I would even compare them to cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies come from a very different angle. They come from an approach of disintermediating the banks, and also disintermediating the central banking authority and the treasury of a country, with a view to establishing networks that exist outside of that system. My personal view, and I mean, this is my view, I'm very happy to take other views, is that I think there are few countries in the world that will allow that. I think the age of the public permissionless blockchain cryptocurrency will over time draw to a close as the regulators start to regulate it, and may even move to a more underground position as central bank digital currencies become more prominent and governments start supporting that as the primary digital system for value transfer.
I mean, that's interesting. Really, sort of, down the line, blurred framework that could play out at the end of the day. So I have two more questions that I'm going to ask. So one is still related to regulatory. The other one is not related to regulatory, but I think it's a very curious question. So let's take the regulatory one first. And this is about the classification of cryptocurrencies, right? Now, this person is asking, so with respect to classifying cryptocurrencies as securities, are there a couple of regulations, perhaps even not in Africa, that are pointing towards the kind of trend that we could see play out in terms of regulating cryptocurrencies as securities?
That's a very difficult one, because there's a very big spectrum. When you work with the US, for example, which has been the primary debate topic when it comes to securities, they have the Howey test, which is a very easy or slippery test to apply, such that it's very likely that if operating a certain way, that your currencies would amount to securities within their regime. So in the US, there is a very high likelihood that you could be trading in securities. You take the alternative, for example, South Africa, we've got a much more narrower test when it comes to what qualifies as securities. I think the major thought process should be, is this being used as a form of equity or investment in a business, and is that business using it as a way to basically equity fund its capital? But I almost want to say it's almost difficult to pull a trend, because the trends point in different directions based on whether you're looking at countries like the US with a very broad definitional schema, and those with a much more narrowed schema, as is the case in South Africa.
Interesting. I think that, the multiplicity of the direction definitely makes it difficult to narrow down, but perhaps over time, some of these elements may start having some form of correlations. So here's the last question, and relates to succession. So assuming I have a crypto, I hold a cryptocurrency worth $10 million, for instance, and I die. What happens? Are there any trends that we can look at in terms of transfer of these currencies to beneficiaries of the holder after that?
Sorry, I do apologize. I didn't hear the last part of that question. Would you mind repeating?
Yes. So I mean, a typical holder of a cryptocurrency, right? I mean, he's human. He could die, right? So let's say he dies, and ordinarily within a couple of the succession laws or real estate laws relating to transfer of assets upon death, usually have that asset vested or transferred to the beneficiary of persons named in a particular will. So the question is that something that can really play out within the cryptocurrency space over time? Are there any trends in this regard?
Absolutely. This has actually emerged in some South African scenarios where an individual who had access to the private key of a specific wallet disappeared with that private key. He was a custodial holder and sort of skipped the country. And why that's important is that's a good example of what you're talking about, is where the individual who holds it basically dies. Now, the problem is a technological one, actually. In some of the crypto structures, and I'll use Bitcoin as an example, if you lose your private key, it's the equivalent of destroying the asset. Because of the mathematical difficulty that is in place, if you do not have a backup recordal of that specific key. And the same thing would apply to an individual who passes away and whose private key is not recorded in some way. There is no central sort of authority to go to ask in a public permissionless system for them to reverse or disclose those keys. Now, that's why when you look at this at a very sort of rudimentary level, the reality is that the trend emerging is that we need to start understanding from a legal perspective, what does that mean when a private key is lost or stolen or completely destroyed? The reality is that you could regard that as a complete loss. And from a tax perspective, some entities have been questioning this. For example, where private keys has been lost, whether they could regard that or record that as a loss for tax purposes. Similarly, whether for insolvency purposes, where you're having an insolvent entity being wound up, if its private keys go missing, for example, in this example, that was the specific question, does the person drawing up the liquidation and distribution account for the insolvency now record the cryptocurrency, which could be worth millions, as an asset for distribution or not? And the question there was, will the court then determine that that has been destroyed? Now, courts haven't really answered this yet on the continent in a way that I think we can say there's a definite legal trend. But I think there's a lot of academic thought that's going on what the direction there is going to be.
Okay, so I mean, really through his questions on, thank you so much, Ashley, really through his questions on regulations and all. But I just have two additional ones. So the first one relates to, what are your, sort of key takeaways that regulators should bear in mind while trying to regulate or at least put their feet into the cryptocurrency space. The second would be, so if you are a young lawyer today, right, who is interested in technology law practice, what are the, some of the key sectors that you say, subsectors that you say, oh, you can go into this space and, it has quite meaningful traction over the next couple of years. So, yeah.
Awesome. I mean, when it comes to regulators, I always use the adage of, think about not what to regulate, but why do you regulate? And I usually always come down to four major reasons why you'd regulate in the financial space. Number one would be financial stability. We all want to make sure that our country's economic system still functions. So the first thing you will always see regulators do, and regulators tend to do, is make some kind of pronouncement for financial stability. For example, that cryptocurrencies are not legal tender. That's the kind of statement you'll see. The second is obviously because of finances being used for alternate or irregular means. The next one would be anti-money laundering and AML, any sort of counter-terrorism or counter-money laundering laws is the next pillar that I would say regulators would typically look to. And those two pillars are the first ones that right off the gate, you will see regulators make some sort of pronouncements. Then there's the waiting period when we get to the next two. The next one is consumer protection. And I feel like when it comes to consumer protection and investor protection, regulators are going to take a much longer period, because there, I think the intention is not to stifle innovation, but at the same time to also identify what the consumer risks are. And there you need to let the market run for a bit before you can really identify what those are. And I think that's what many regulators are doing. And then the last is regulatory arbitrage. I would say regulatory arbitrage is starting to reduce. Whereas in 2017, you saw many countries, especially small tax haven type countries, have regulations that were very friendly. I think a lot of them are coming under international pressure to almost step in line and have a much more standardized approach. So that's when it comes to the regulators, what I think the key takeaway should be in terms of future trends. When it comes to a young lawyer, I would say that from a legal perspective, this impacts us tremendously. Not just the cryptocurrency chain of thought, but also the underlying technologies, specifically things like blockchain technologies. How do they influence our work in future? There are concepts such as decentralized autonomous organizations, which could replace or at least be a type of company in a commercial system. Now, how do us lawyers ensure that there is proper company law governance in those kind of structures? There could be transactions, and in these systems, they are done through smart contracts or digital contracts. How will we provide our advice in respect of smart contracts? One aspect will be, how do we audit these? Many technologists will want to come to lawyers to say, please audit this and tell me that this is achieving legally what I wanted to achieve. To do so, we need to start understanding the technology much, much better than we used to. I think the time where lawyers can say they don't want to get under the hood when it comes to technology is ending. I think it is important for us to now start seeing the overlap between the tech and the law going forward.
Thank you so much, Ashlin. It's been an incredible session with you this evening. So much intelligence, so much competence, and we are really, really grateful for you, spending your time with us this evening. Thank you so much. I don't know if you have any last words that you wanted to say or share with us.
Not besides to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if any of you want to contact me, you're more than welcome to, if you have any other questions. I will note that Baker McKenzie has recently released its Crypto Assets Around the World report, which not only looks at Africa, but other countries around the world, where you can go and dive in a bit deeper if you want to see the comparison between different countries' regulations. I'll be happy to share a link to that to the organizers to be shared with the group.
Thank you so much, Ashlin. And I'm sure a lot of people have been asking me whether they are going to get the slides as well.
Yes, this will be shared as well.
Thank you so much, Ashlin. And thank you, Jeremy, for making this happen. And I wish everybody a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.